heavily skeptical about the fashion marketing effort around the watch, and left persuaded that it was actually probably the right sensibility, if not a bit overkill. And the reason being, if the fashion industry, rejected the watch from the outset, it would have been doomed to living the life of a Fitbit. It would not be something that you'd see on the wrists of people at high-end restaurants in New York City, much less on the wrist of an athlete who's running around a track. So it needed to start with fashion and the acceptance of the fashion world so that the rest of the world could accept the device. But perhaps maybe leaning so far into that world would have been wise and prudent. At the same time, like, the bigger problem with the watch that we haven't mentioned is that its functionality was insufficient in the initial edition to really be much more than focused on around fashion.
Yeah, and nobody really knew what it was for either.
Right. I mean, the book goes into great detail about the various strains within Apple.
Second part of the interview with Jonathan Mosen, with the author
around the time to do kind of glucose monitoring.
The book.
So there were some health sensibilities
about Apple. So I'm going to listen to that.
Ouais,
ben ça c'est la deuxième partie de l'auteur qui parle avec Jonathan Mosen dans une entrevue. Il parle de son livre qu'il avait écrit par rapport à Apple. Okay.
All these things were kind of swirling around.
That's it, guys.
And then became tied up in the watch itself. Not to mention the external pressure from Wall Street, which was saying, well, you have to make something new, in the sense that they needed to replace the iPhone eventually.
And by the time the watch came along, it was becoming less common to line up for hours for iPhones the day before. But I do remember getting my first Apple Watch right after it came out, and the sense of ceremony that accompanied it. You know, you'd sit down for a fitting, and you'd be helped to choose the band and the particular material that the watch was made of, and it was an experience that they created with that.
Right. I mean, the book goes into some detail about how they overhauled the store and went through a tremendous amount of training for staff so that they would identify who was walking through the door, what type of watch they might purchase. They would scan their wrist to see what type of watch they already had on. They could assess whether or not somebody was, say, a wealthy farmer that should actually be buying a stainless steel watch, or a teacher that was best suited in an aluminum watch, and then kind of price them into what they deemed most appropriate.
And yet it seems that the argument you're making in the book is that by the time the Apple Watch came along, this is where the wheels really had started to fall off product development, and the watch was forced out the door too soon. As you say, it was slow, it was clunky, and its purpose was not clearly defined. So I guess you would consider that a bit of a botched launch to some degree?
Right. I mean, there's a moment at the tail end or just on the precipice of the watch's launch a couple months beforehand, where one of the lead engineers goes to Jeff Williams, who was technically responsible for the watch's development, and says, Jeff, hey, Jeff, if you showed up today and forgot your iPhone, what would you do? And Jeff says, go home and get it. So, well, if you show up today and you forgot your watch, what would you do, Jeff? And he said, I guess I'd get it tonight. And the engineer looked at him and he said, see, that's why we shouldn't launch the watch. It's not ready yet. Because they really had not defined its capabilities in a way that would fulfill customers' expectations. There's so much emphasis at the time of that initial event on how accurate the timekeeping would be. And yet, for many people inside Apple, one of the real struggles as they went to promote it was their own recognition that it could only tell time half of the time that people wore it, because the battery life needed to be prolonged. So they came up with this temporary solution where you had to tilt the watch to your face and look at it in order to get the time, which meant even as a timepiece, it wasn't fully functional.
I read your book with voiceover on my phone, as I said, and something that came up was so extraordinary to me that I stopped and made voiceover read it again to make sure that I heard it right. You tell an extraordinary story in the book about a chip that Apple found from a startup during the development of the watch that could detect cancer. And people were talking about implementing that chip, and there was some discussion about false positives, reputational risk. Can you tell me a bit more about that? And I'm curious about what became of that startup and that chip.
It was really just it was emblematic of some of the health aspirations of the company at at the time and what they hope they can make the watch become. And in the course of exploring those various avenues, they did come upon the possibility of a startup that said it could identify cancer, and they investigated it, and it was pretty abruptly shot down, in part because someone on the team said, well, what's it going to be like when Apple is the bearer of bad news and says, hey, you have cancer? And then what's worse than that, what if Apple doesn't tell you, and then is it liable for that failure or that shortcoming? And they quickly realized that the world of health was far more complex than the world of sending email and text and opening up apps and playing music on your phone. So they abandoned the effort. I am not sure what happened to that particular startup. I couldn't begin to tell you, but it was more just a flavor in the process of kind of the heyday and thrill of thinking big and broad about what the watch could be, and then the realization that within that pursuit that they couldn't do everything that they wanted to, because health is just such a complicated field, one that they had never really tried to tap before.
But you see, now that I know that, I know of a couple of people actually who have died of cancer, who were Apple Watch owners, and I stopped in my tracks after reading that paragraph in the book, and I thought, had they been given an early diagnosis, would they still be here?
Yeah. I mean, it's an amazing thing to think about. But as you talk to people who worked on the health aspects of the watch and the glucose monitoring ambitions of the company, everybody's body is so different physiologically that it's impossible to kind of streamline a device in a way that it performs consistently for every single individual, much less go through the hoops of getting the FDA approval and navigating the bureaucracy in the U.S. that you would need to release it. So I hear what you're saying. You can imagine why everyone was wide-eyed about the possibility and potential of this capability, but also quickly brought back down to earth by some of the complications and the reality of what implementing that would mean.
The subtitle of the book, which says that Apple has lost its soul, even though by Wall Street definitions it's one of the most successful companies in the world. It's extremely rare for any company, of course, to produce one truly disruptive product, and Apple's done it several times when Ive and Jobs were working together. Is it realistic to think that had Jobs lived, they would have been able to continue that degree of disruption, or might we have seen the incrementalism that we now have anyway?
Hey, people who work closely with Jobs like to laugh and think that if he was still there, the company would have never reached the financial achievements that it has. In part because I think like he would have decided to disrupt the iPhone with some other device and cut off and choked off all that growth and potential of the device that has been rocket fuel for their business performance. I can't help but laugh and think about that because he's just so cavalier, and he did that time and time again, whether that was with the iPod Mini being replaced by the iPod Nano or the iPod itself really being replaced by the iPhone. He showed he was willing to roll the dice and make risk. I can only assume that he would try to do so. I think the open question is what would be the consequences of that, and would it be successful or not? In retrospect, we can look back at the past decade and say there really hasn't been a revolutionary new product. There's been the implementation of AI and artificial intelligence across speakers through the Echo and Alexa and Google Assistant, Google Home, and Apple's attempts with HomePod. But that product hasn't been truly disruptive. Electric vehicles, as developed by Tesla, have disrupted the automobile industry, but Apple hasn't participated in that field. Television is being unbundled, but it's not been disrupted by any single device. So I don't know that Apple has missed anything, but it has not inspired the imagination in the same way that it did with the series of devices it developed between 2000 and 2010.
And it's interesting because